Hello, welcome again to our continuing study of world mythology. And we've been considering the pantheons, the houses of the gods of the various cultures, the Greeks, the Sumerians, and the Egyptians, and ancient India, and a lot of other places, East Asia, Africa, and so on. And what a rich set of stories that is, what a rich set of traditions and personifications of the supreme being archetype. And so today I want to go deeper into that core idea, that supreme being archetype, the idea of God itself as an archetype of something mysterious, ineffable, profound, and for billions and billions of people around the world, ultimately real. So today I want to consider what Joseph Campbell calls the masks of God, or the masks of eternity. You recall our discussion earlier about the supreme being archetype. It's, in a nutshell, this rather simple idea that we see all over the world. That's how archetypes work, right? Universal ideas that are transcultural, transtemporal, everywhere, all the time. And the idea at root is simply this, that there is, behind the surface of the visible plane, the sensory world, there is a hidden realm, a hidden world that is hidden from us by the perceptual field, what in Hinduism we call Maya. And that hidden reality is understood to be superior to and the source of the visible plane. Yeah? Now, that invisible plane, that mysterious something that we can't see, taste, touch, hear, or feel, or smell, that invisible plane gets conceptualized differently all over the world. It's personified, as we saw with all the pantheons, and as we see with the Abrahamic faiths and so on. And there are cultures that leave it in the impersonal realm, like the Tao of the ancient wisdom tradition of China, Taoism, or even in the depths of Vedanta philosophy, Brahman, the ground of being out of which all forms come, but which is itself formless, eternal, impersonal. So that's the rich variety around the supreme being archetype. Everywhere you go, there is that supreme being archetype. The difference lies in how that depth reality is conceptualized. And what Joseph Campbell calls that is the masks of God. It's a really wonderful and simple and I think very useful way to consider this question about why are there so many different gods and different kinds of gods, or to put a finer point on it, just focusing here in the Western traditions and focusing just on Christianity, say, or the Judeo-Christian tradition of the Bible, that God itself has 10, 12 different masks, different attributes, different qualities that are sometimes hard to integrate together. Sometimes he's the enraged punisher. Sometimes he's the merciful caregiver. Sometimes he acts kind of capriciously and randomly. Other times it's profoundly organized and deeply compassionate. So wait a minute, that's all coming from the same guy? So this is the challenge of that maybe the idea of God concepts as masks might help us unpack a little bit. I think Campbell kind of boils it down this way, that all of our gods, all of our goddesses are literary, mythological creations, projections, to kind of borrow a Freudian word, projections out of our own imagination onto the mystery of the cosmos. That's where the gods and goddesses come from. They come from us. We personified the energies of the cosmos as, mostly in the anthropomorphic systems as men and women, as sometimes in the Egyptians they sort of combine, and in India too, they combine animal parts and human parts, but they are often anthropomorphic or human form personifications. And Campbell's arguing we made those masks. Now we'll get to the question in a few minutes, what's behind the mask? Because the atheists are going to say, there ain't nothing behind the mask. It's just a bunch of made up personifications. But people who are not atheists argue there is something behind the mask. So we'll get to that in a little bit. But I think let's start here. As we study world mythology and world religion, we see a plethora of examples of gods and goddesses and masks of God, if you will. And if we made those masks, what were they based on? Where did those ideas come from? Why is this God like this and this goddess like that? Well, I think the God masks come from basically three things. They're based on three things: environment, sociology, and need. So let's start with environment. It's pretty simple, really, right? The mythological systems of the Pacific Islanders, Fiji and Hawaii and all of those beautiful places in Oceanica. Their gods and goddesses are dolphins and sea turtles and seabirds. And when you go to the American Southwest for the Navajo and the Hopi, their gods and goddesses are coyote and raven and spider. You look at the environment around you and you draw those images to turn into your metaphor, to turn into your personification. So that's how the environment impacts the way we personify or our gods or create our masks. The second factor, I think, is sociology. From a patriarchal society where men have power, women do not, and power is, and this often comes up in hunter-gatherer and later animal husbandry cultures, herding cultures, like the Hebrews, like the Aryans, and like in many cases the Greeks, with sheep and cattle and horses and that sort of thing. These are patriarchal cultures often. And so the male qualities of violence, of war, those become wrapped up into your god mask. You have male deities, and you might have a pantheon of all kinds of men and women, gods and goddesses. But as we see in the Hebrew Bible, it all gets distilled down to one, for Christians anyway, masculine God, a father God. In a different sociology, in a very ancient, primordial, more agricultural-based society, you might see a matrilineal, matrifocal, matriarchal culture. And in that case then, well, if your notion of human power is largely female, then you project that sociology onto the heavens. You live in a culture in which the cosmos is a goddess, Shakti, Mahadevi, Gaia, etc. So I think the sociology of the people conceiving of God or goddess has an enormous impact on the kind of mask of God that they portray for themselves. The third element was our needs. What do you need? I mean, if you're constantly under siege, think about it. Warrior culture, they're always, herding culture. They're always moving their cattle, their sheep, their goats to fresh grazing land. So you're always traveling. You don't have a home valley like an agricultural society does, like the Egyptians do around the Nile. If you're a herding culture, you're always moving the herd around. You're always on somebody else's land. You're always in conflict with others. And the warrior ethos begins to dominate because you find yourself in violent conflict all the time, being attacked or having to attack to survive. So you need a warrior god. We're going to see a passage in a moment here from the Hebrew Bible that perfectly exemplifies that. Maybe it's fertility you need. You need more fecund crops and animals. So you need a god or a goddess of fertility who's about abundance, who's about generation. Or maybe you are, after horrific suffering, maybe you need solace and comfort. So your god or goddess is that's going to be part of their persona, their mask, how they show up, the great comforting god or goddess. Think the Virgin Mary. as opposed to the punishing Yahweh who sends floods, right? The Virgin Mary is that, I know she's not really a goddess, but she's kind of a personification of the divine for many Roman Catholics and other Christians. And she is just the cool mom who's waiting for you after school with a plate of cookies, and she doesn't care what you did, she loves you. So what about the wisdom, the sage archetype? The God as the wisdom giver. Jesus often plays that role. Buddha plays that role. The one who has the clarity of insight to guide you through this horrible problem that you're in. What about healing? That's another need that we have that we pack into our God concepts. This is a God who heals, who restores, who brings us out of woundedness and back to wholeness. Think about how Jesus goes around in the Gospels healing people. There's a really obvious example. What about forgiveness? We need forgiveness for our sins, for the harm that we've done, for the mistakes that I've made, the people I've hurt. Sometimes we pack that into our God concept. This is a God who can clean us, who can help us be reborn. What about order? That's another need that we have. We're sick of all this chaos and not knowing, and so we make our God concept the great lawgiver, the great orderer, the great restorer of sanity and reason and fairness. Yeah? And you see that throughout the Hebrew Bible. So all these different needs, like what about all of the above? All those ones I just checked off? Yes, please, on every single one of those. So that could be, and we certainly see that in some God concepts. So Campbell wants us to slow down when we approach a new God or goddess and simply ask, what environment did this God image come from? What was the sociology of these people that led them to gravitate toward this God concept? And what needs did they have that they then turned their God or goddess into the solution of, the provider of those needs? In other words, all of the qualities, characteristics, personality, and attributes of all of the gods and goddesses came out of the human imagination in the hunger to respond to those challenges. And so the question then becomes, as we hinted at before, what's behind the mask? And for the atheist, it's simple, right? The atheist would say, ain't nothing behind the mask. There is nothing. There is no transcendent reality. Therefore, all gods and goddesses are cartoon characters, mythological, made up, and don't have much value. And different atheists are going to disagree about the value they may or may not have. But atheism certainly is united around the idea that there is nothing behind the mask. These are, in Freud's terms, these are delusions. These are just neurotic wishes, fantasies that we'd be better off without. Now, if the atheists say there's nothing behind the mask, then the mystics of all the world's religions say that there is everything behind the mask, everything. That what is in fact behind the mask is so much more vast, boundless, undefinable, limitless, and incomprehensible, beyond whatever puny qualities you manage to pack into your portrait of God, your portrait of the transcendent. And we tend to make the gods look like us. I saw a picture of, in an old magazine, Life magazine, of paintings of Jesus from all over the world. It was really cool because they put, I think, like 16 of them on one page. And as you would expect, in Korea, Jesus looks Korean. And in Ethiopia, Jesus looks Ethiopian. And in Sweden, Jesus looks Swedish, blonde hair and blue eyes. And so all portraits of Jesus are self-portraits of the artist in the country she or he is working in, because we need our gods to kind of look like us, because in that bhakti or devotional energy, how do you have a relationship with something that looks like a toad or whatever, right? You want a familial resemblance. So we tend to make gods and goddesses after our own likeness, in idealized form, of course. So Again, the mystics of Christianity and Islam and Judaism, and this is common in the wisdom traditions of India and East Asia as well. They argue that reality behind the mask is undefinable. You can't explain it, you can't talk about it, you can't name it. In fact, you can only say what it is not. And so in Christian mysticism, via negativa, that's the Latin phrase you read in the Middle Ages from the Christian mystics who argue we cannot say what God is. We cannot take the positive path or positive way. We can only take the negative way. We can only say what God is not. And in Sanskrit, the phrase is neti, neti, neti. Not this, not that, not this. It's the same idea that we see in the Tao Te Ching when Lao Tzu starts the book about the Tao, which is the Chinese concept of ultimate reality, but impersonal. The opening line of the Tao Te Ching, this famous line, of course, says that the Tao that can be told is not the eternal Tao. There it is. And he puts a finer point on it a couple of chapters later when he says that those who say don't know, and those who know don't say. So silence is the language of God. Contemplation is the presence of God. The more you talk about God, the more you're just talking about yourself. You're just talking about your own culturally conditioned concepts of what God is. You're adding more and more qualities and attributes and characteristics onto something. And the more you add on, the Taoists say, the further away you get from truth. It's about emptying out all of these qualities, neti, the via negativa. But, as Campbell points out, all of these masks of God are useful. They are useful. You don't want to throw them all away because they help us know in which direction to look. They show us where to look. They may even convey some of the qualities of the transcendent that are useful to us in our time and place. But in the end, all of the masks are too limiting. In fact, the mask, think about this in terms of the supreme being archetype, the mask of God becomes the final obstacle to be overcome. If you're trying to get to God, the mask is in the way. And maybe we'll put it this way. If you really want to know God, you have to forget everything you know about God. All of your concepts in the language that we're using here in this video, the masks of God, all of your concepts are, in the end, hindrances to your experience of the transcendent. And furthermore, the more we attach to our metaphors, the more we say, I've got the right mask, your masks are all crap. The more we do that, the more we are divided as a human family. And ironically, the further away you get from the very experience for which you long, oneness with the divine. So to get more playful with our God concepts, to be able to worship with Muslims, with in an African American Baptist church, in an Anglican church, with the Mormons, with Hindus, in a Orthodox synagogue, in a Reform synagogue, in a Native American sweat lodge or powwow ceremony, to be able to walk into any of those settings and realize, oh, here's a different mask. But what's behind the mask in all of these houses of worship is the one mystery, the archetypal upwelling of the capital R real that we call in the Western tradition God. Now, finally, I want to turn to the biblical tradition. I got my new international version here. And I want to turn to some passages from the Hebrew Bible, what Christians call the Old Testament, just as one last example of this God mask idea. Because in the Hebrew Bible, and of course Christians add the New Testament on, and that is a lot. There's a lot in this book, right? And there are many masks. In other words, this is kind of a challenge, isn't it? When you decide to go monotheistic, as the Hebrews did, Your one God must absorb all of the qualities and attributes and characteristics of all the gods and goddesses that the Hebrews conquer and vanquish. So your new singular monotheistic God comes to embody all of the qualities that used to be embodied by the goddesses and gods around them. You know, God initially was this thundering kind of presence in the sky, but then when the goddesses were conquered, the generation of the grain, the ripening of the wheat, the falling of the rain, the abundance of the earth, all that earth goddess stuff, those are now the qualities of our God. So all of the qualities of the vanquished God get rolled up into the one God. And that's what makes the biblical God kind of complex and, shall we say, many, many masks. The creator mask, right? The book of Genesis, like we've seen in many traditions. The lawgiver mask, certainly in the Ten Commandments, frankly, the entire Torah, right? The first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Deuteronomy, and Numbers, called the Torah. Jesus just calls it the law. That's how it's translated into English in the New Testament. God's law, 600 and something laws, right? A lot more than 10. Pages and pages and pages of the most minute guidance about dietary restrictions and sexuality and marriage and how to manage your slave population and how tort law works, who gets sued when, and what are my financial responsibilities if I accidentally burn down my neighbor's barn. And it's like a penal code of legal guidance. So this is a law-giving God, certainly in the Hebrew Bible. We also see the Punisher, right? The guy who blew up Sodom because it was so evil. The God who killed everybody on earth except Noah early on, right? In the middle of the book of Genesis with the flood. And also the protector God, the war God. And again, growing out of the need of the Hebrews who were finding themselves constantly at war. So I'm looking at Deuteronomy 20, 20, verse 10 and 18, 10 through 18. I just want to share this with you. It's a particularly gruesome portrait of a warrior God that reminds me of Kali, the fearsome visage of the wife of the god of destruction in India, Shiva. Kali is a bloodthirsty war goddess. And I get a taste of that here in Deuteronomy 20, verses 10 through 18. So this is God saying, when you march up to attack a city, make its people an offer of peace. If they accept and open their gates, all the people in it shall be subject to forced labor and shall work for you. So you walk up to this neighboring city and you say to them, we are here to conquer your city. And if they open the gates, they all become your slaves. Okay. And if they refuse to make peace and they engage you in battle, how rude of them not to just agree to be your slave. If they fight back, then lay siege to that city. And when the Lord your God delivers it unto your hand, put to the sword all the men in it. That's not Geneva Convention warfare. Line up all the men on their knees in front of a ditch and cut their heads off. It's like an ISIS video or something. It is horrific what this God is commanding, and in violation of all our ethics, certainly. It's a stretch, isn't it, to kind of put this God together with all the other portraits. Let me just add a little more. As for the women, the children, and the livestock, and everything else in the city, you may take these as plunder. Some translations have booty, with all of its salacious implications, for yourselves. And you may use the plunder the Lord your God gives you from your enemies. This is how you are to treat all the cities that are at a distance from you and do not belong to the nations nearby. However, the cities of the nations that the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance, the closer cities, do not leave alive anything that breathes. Completely destroy them And then he gives you a hit list of all the peoples that he wants you to slaughter. Hittites, Amorites, Canaanites, Perizzites, Hivites, Jebusites, as the Lord your God has commanded you. And here's the reason. Otherwise, they will teach you to follow all of the detestable things they do in worshiping their gods, and you will sin against the Lord your God. This is a local warrior God helping the Hebrews prevail, to put it euphemistically, over their neighbors who have their own gods, and whose gods are clearly, in this God's mind, evil and false and horrible. So this is not yet the God of all the world, right? We have not yet evolved to that place. So that passage really leaves a bad taste in your mouth of horrific cruelty. But look, here's another, so that's one mask, right? The bloodthirsty war god. Here's another mask, though. The sage who counsels us in wisdom, who helps us expand our innate selfishness to include care ethics, universal care ethics for others. Now I'm at Deuteronomy 24, verses 17 through 22. He says, this is God saying, do not deprive the alien or the orphan of justice, or take the cloak of the widow as a pledge. Remember that you were slaves in Egypt, and the Lord your God redeemed you from there. That is why I command you to do this. So think of who in our society, who the aliens are, who the outsiders are, and what God just commanded us to do. Don't just take care of your own family, take care of the stranger too. And he goes on in verse 19, when you are harvesting in your field and you overlook a sheaf, do not go back to get it. Leave it for the alien, the fatherless, and the widow, so that the Lord your God may bless you in all the work of your hands. When you beat the olives from your trees, do not go over the branches a second time. Leave what remains for the alien, the fatherless, and the widow. And when you harvest the grapes of your vineyard, do not go over the vines again. Leave what remains for the alien, the fatherless, and the widow. Remember that you were slaves in Egypt. That is why I command you to do this. This is the spiritual, scriptural basis of tithing. Whatever you have been given, leave 10% of it for others who have less than you. And in Leviticus 19:33, 19:33 and 34, when an alien lives with you in your land, do not mistreat him. The alien living with you must be treated as one of your native born. Love him as yourself, for you were aliens in Egypt. This mask of God, the one who enjoins us to practice radical care. We'll see Jesus take that up, of course, in the New Testament, that we are to love all universally. We are to have mercy on all universally. At the same time, out of the other side of his mouth, Jesus is saying when he comes back, he's going to lay waste to everything and separate the saved from the sinners, and it's not going to go good for the sinners. So look, let's wrap up around this question. How do we integrate all of these God concepts? Just in the biblical tradition, just this Judeo-Christian God, and I would add Allah. Let's bring the Islamic tradition into this as well. It's the same God. So this Judeo-Christian Islamic God wears all the masks. And I find Joseph Campbell's idea liberating, personally, because now I don't have to get caught up in some kind of pointless and frankly kind of silly debate about what God is really like. Because whatever qualities you attribute to God, horrific war God, indifferent punisher, deeply loving, merciful and wise, healing God, whatever, you're right with all of those. And what I see when I look at all of these myths and God stories in all the world's religions, these God masks, is I see people like you and me. I see good men and women wrestling with the same cosmic questions you and I wrestle with. How do I make sense out of this world? And how do I come to some peace with all of the contradictions and paradoxes in which I find myself? And the way I do it is simply allow the mystery to be a mystery. And understand that whatever masks you and I conjure up out of our own environment, sociology, and need, whatever God is beyond all of those masks. Limitless, boundless, and the source of all energy, consciousness, form, and our lives. So, in the bright light of this discussion, that tired dichotomy or binary debate between theism and atheism, to me it kind of shimmers and collapses. Because now, if you're still with me on this video and with all the stuff that we've thought through, I think you can feel it too. That tired old, there is a God, there isn't a God, that whole debate seems sort of simple-minded now. We're so far beyond those narrow definitions, and it's opening up more beautifully and more incomprehensibly and more profoundly than we could have ever imagined when we started this investigation. See you on the other side.